Once again, thank you so much for coming to our second edition of Out of the Box. We did, as Joel mentioned previously, the first edition in April, and we felt that it would be a nice idea, given the range of subjects that Malaysian students tend to pursue, for a number of reasons, as Emily described her parents saying, here are your 4 options. I think it's a fairly common conversation that most students or young people have with their parents. It certainly was a conversation I had with my parents a few years ago. Not so long ago, okay, a long time ago. And it's really interesting when you think about law school and how ideas are formed about what it means to be a lawyer based on things you might watch on TV or, law school sounds glamorous, right? Doesn't it? Isn't that why lots of people think they want to go to law school? I certainly was like, okay, I guess if I have to pick something, law school doesn't seem so bad. And in the work that I do these days, I work with a lot of students, talking to them about why they want to pursue what they want to pursue. And in those conversations, I learn a lot of things, but mostly I learn about how people are, I guess exactly what we've just talked about, kind of parental influence is a huge part of the decision-making process. So the whole point of Out of the Box today is really to get students and parents talking about why does they think they want to pursue a law degree. So I think we'll start off on a fairly light note. How many of you think now, having listened to these guys, that lawyers are also dancers? Yeah, well, we've got 3 people think lawyers are also dancers. I'll maybe start with Jed, actually, because you talked about having to make that decision between what is an interest versus what is a career, right? So what were the things that you thought about that helped you decide that perhaps dance wasn't something that you wanted to pursue as a career?
Okay, like I said earlier, I think dance to me has always been, I love dancing, I enjoy dancing, and I think whenever I'm dancing, I feel like, it's so free and I feel like I'm a different person. So the thing about dancing is that I know that I can't pursue far in dancing because I know eventually I'm going to get old and then I may not be able to dance again, and things like that. So I think that's one of the reasons why, practically speaking, dancing can be a passion, but it cannot be a career to me, personally. So I think I would rather land on something which is more secure in a sense, because I know that being a lawyer, you can pursue quite far. You can open up your own firm. I think it's more of career development I was more concerned about. So after doing some very brief research, that's what I found. And I always think that you can always do what you love doing, but may not necessarily pursuing a career out of it.
Okay. And another theme that sort of I felt throughout all your talks was this idea of the flexibility of pursuing a law degree, that, by doing a law degree, you really can go on to do lots of different things. And I think the 4 of us here are good examples of that. All 4 of us studied law and are doing very different things. So, Mohsen, maybe you might want to talk a little bit about the sort of pedagogy side of things that opens the mind, as it were.
So when it comes to reading law, one of the mistakes that students make is seeing it as an opportunity to acquire information. What are the laws? How are the laws applied? And that's a mistake. Why is it a mistake? Well, because the laws as they were are very different from as they are, and very different from as they're going to be. So I met a gentleman just earlier who's working in blockchain. And then you say, okay, well, how does law regulate blockchain? Well, the hell if lawyers know. So that is one of the challenges. This is a new technology that is developed, and lawyers don't exactly know how to adapt to it. So instead, what they try to do is effectively take the laws that they have and see if they can be adapted in some way to this new technology, and often that's going to result in some type of a Frankenstein that is really going to implode eventually. And that is what we're seeing today. So what I say then is rather what you're trying to develop while you're in legal education, and this is something that was alluded to earlier, you're trying to develop more certain skills. So those skills could be problem-solving skills, It could be cognitive skills, how to think through a particular situation. Understandings, one thing that I try to teach my students a lot is this notion of provocative thinking. So how to think differently about it in a way that you might otherwise not. In a way we often think in a very linear, structured fashion. So breaking away out of that structure. So this is where you see education. Yes, I understand the importance because of the high cost today. I see the importance, I understand the desire to be employable post-degree. And that's part of it. But as a result, because there's so much emphasis placed on being employable, not enough emphasis is actually placed on the education itself. And the education is meant to upskill you and encourage you very much to provoke you to open your minds rather than to close them to just be a worker bee. So it's that opening of the mind that pedagogically what we're trying to achieve, and thinking then in your education in terms of that metaphor, the idea that you're actually opening it rather than closing it.
Great. And Emily, obviously you now work in the tech industry. How do you feel that some of the things you learn at university help you with your day-to-day work?
There are the things that are directly helpful. So in the earlier days when I was working, with very small startups who couldn't afford lawyers, I somehow ended up being the in-house legal person, even though I was at that point, many years past my law degree. The understanding of how to read a contract stays with you forever. So that's one very direct way. But besides that, I think what Mohsin said is very relevant. There's this idea of learning the soft skills, and I think it's not just necessarily law that gives you that. If you go into university with the approach that you will learn how to learn, then you come up with that skill later in your career as well. What I do in particular requires a lot of on-the-fly problem solving. So a company can come up to us and say, we have currently 100 customers and we have no idea how to take that to 1,000. What can we do, right? And one thing you will learn in law school is you have this problem, this client has done this thing or wants to do these things, and you have this set defined of rules that you can now use to apply to this solution in the most creative way possible. So I think that was one thing that I took out of my law degree, how to take a situation and find solutions for that situation as quickly as possible, as creatively as possible, and as efficiently as possible. And yeah, that remains very relevant for me until today.
Yeah, I certainly feel it helps me in the work that I do as well, that sort of problem-solving aspect of going to law school, that I think at the time when you're doing your law degree, you don't necessarily recognize that that's what's happening. And it's only really later when you're, in your job, whatever job that is, you recognize the skills that you've picked up.
I will say this though, law school forces you to take in a high degree of information in a very short period of time. I didn't realize when I went to uni, I don't know if you guys did, that studying law required me to read ferociously. Every day I would have a stack of readings about this thick, and I'd have to get through it by the end of the day. If you don't do that, you probably will not get out of your degree with a good mark, and I, at that point, really desperately wanted it because I'm a Kiasu Asian. So anyway, I worked through all these readings, but because of that, I cultivated the skill of being able to read and digest information very quickly, and that until today.
I couldn't agree more. I think if you are going to go to law school, don't do what I did, which is in the first semester kind of go, do I really need to read all this stuff?
You do.
and then after my first semester and I got my results, I was like, oh, I do really need to read everything that they're telling me to read. But yeah, that skill of digesting lots of quite dense information is definitely something that I found particularly useful later when I pursued a master's in a non-law subject. That ability to digest quite complex ideas holds you in good stead, whatever you choose to pursue. Just one more thing before we open the floor to the questions. Open the questions to the floor. Anyway, whichever way you want to say that. All of you talked about obstacles. I think if you could just quickly say how you respond to an obstacle, like what's if an obstacle's before you, How do you deal with it? Maybe give an example of a difficult situation that you've had.
I think my motivation of getting through challenges is the fact that you get recognized. Like, once you get through the challenge, you will feel very like you have done something. And that probably is my main motivation of wanting to get through challenges.
I think for me, it's knowing that the obstacle is not forever. And also how you deal with that obstacle is not necessarily forever either. Like nothing is permanent, and you may think that, when you come up to a pivotal point in your life, it's going to be life-defining. And the reality is that's not always necessarily true. You might choose to go down one path, and there's this Robert Frost poem that I think everybody's familiar with, like the road less traveled or whatever. The reality is you don't know what the road on the other side looks like. So just pick one. It doesn't matter. In the end, you pick one and you do the best out of what you've, decided to pursue, and you come up on the other side, and there will be another pivotal point, another obstacle or whatever it is, and then deal with that. Just basically, the long and short of it is just deal with it. Just move on.
So I appreciate a point that was made earlier, I believe by Emily, where she said that she learned to learn, so it was learning about learning. I often speak to my students about metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. And one of the points that I make to them is that whenever you're dealing with some type of a problem, well, is it a problem? Is it an obstacle? Is it a challenge? Is it an opportunity? Is it a threat? It very much depends on how you identify it. That is going to influence how you ultimately deal with it. So sometimes there are obstacles that are threats. Sometimes, and you really just need to get away from that threat. Sometimes there are obstacles that are just challenges, or even there are obstacles that are opportunities that can be seized. So very much when it comes to the thinking about thinking, it's that metacognition, it's how am I going to tackle this? And I often like to use the metaphor of the game of chess. Well, it's great to use a game of chess. Different opponents require different strategies. Different moves require different responses. You often want to approach a game in a different way. So as much as you can have then this approach that you use, that you deploy to deal with problems, I say have a variety. Try to expand your arsenal as much as possible so that when this situation arises, and the situation's arriving on a daily basis, you arrive to the bus stop and the bus you're waiting for doesn't come. What are you going to do? Well, you have to deal with this situation. And that is really the way I treat it. These are situations that have to be dealt with, and having a wide variety of strategies to deal with a wide variety of situations is the skill that ultimately you want to hone while you're at university.
Yeah, and I think a really important thing to remember, and Emily sort of alluded to this, is that life is not linear, right? There are various points at which you will face obstacles and you will have to sort of make quite difficult decisions. But that point of just making that decision and being uncertain where it might lead to is really not a bad thing. Anyway, okay, that's enough from us for now. Who has questions? So there are 2 microphones set up here. So if you just want to go up to one of the microphones and ask a question, you can either ask it to the whole group, or you can ask a specific question to one of the speakers. Yeah.
Yes, good evening to our distinguished panel of speakers. Of course, I'm not a law student. I'm just past the age and stage to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a policeman just to hold a gun. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer, but I ended up doing accountancy and ended up being an internal auditor. And, the 3 lecturers who taught, a tutor during my school days who taught me ended up as a judge. My law lecturer during my A-levels ended up as a judicial commissioner, and another lecturer when I was doing my accountancy ended up as an industrial court chairman. But law was not my interest, but accountancy was more towards my interest, okay? Now, the question I like to pose, by being a lawyer, potential lawyers here, the students, is it advisable for them to specialize in an area like criminal law, corporate law, patents and copyrights, or family law? Because when I was serving the bank, I was in the internal audit department, and we had lawyers who are very good dancers. The mouth did the dancing before getting into the panel. The moment they are in the panel, they don't dance, they don't perform. And I was auditing the loans documentation, this and that, and I discovered a lot of things. And top of that, there was an overriding internal auditor, there's the Bank Negara auditors who were auditing my performance and questioning me why the lawyer's done this, why a lot of lawyers are not good in corporate matters, but like to be in the panel of banks. And the bank which I worked for lost out 35 million out of lawyers' negligence. What we discovered is that when we engage lawyers, if they are not specialized in banking or corporate matters, the client has got everything to lose out, you know. Most we can lodge a complaint with the bar can strike off the lawyer from the rolls, but the bank has lost 35 million, which is 17% of their paid up capital. If you had another fiasco like that, the bank might probably have to close down, you know. And so in this respect, from experience as an internal auditor, auditing loan documentation, I think it'll be right for lawyers to specialize in the area and practice in that scope. Will you agree with me?
Okay.
I just need your opinion on that. Thank you.
So I'm from that I'm getting that the question really is that should lawyers specialize? Lawyer?
Okay, if you ask me, I would think that specializing in a subject matter would definitely be a good option, a good thing that you can think about. And the reason is because be the master of one rather than jacks of many, right? So I think I can use this as an example. Like if you play badminton, you know, you master the skill of playing badminton, rather than, you know, being a general sportsman who does, you know, running, badminton, tennis, and so on and so forth. So specializing definitely have to me has more pros than cons. And if you're specialized in a particular area, you sort of have more in-depth knowledge, and that's when everything becomes easier for you to manage, because then when a client asks you a particular question, then you can answer it immediately because you know it in and out. And I think, especially if you are representing a client, you may want to know certain subject matter very in-depth, in a very very deeply, so that you can provide accurate and sort of up-to-date legal advice. So I certainly would say that specializing is better than doing like general corporate law. But having said that, I think before you specialized, I would think that is a very practical thing to do for you to know more about each subject, so that when you specialize in something, you know that at least you have tried the other subject matters.
Because that was going to be my follow-on question, perhaps to Mohsen. At what stage do you think someone should make that decision to specialize?
So I would probably say never, really. So I have to respectfully disagree with both the gentlemen here regarding specialization. I take their points, and there is certainly great value in specializing. So even when I was practicing for a number of years, there was an particular area of practice that I focused on. In my case, it was intellectual properties. But I also recall the writings of this fantastic Palestinian scholar, Edward Said, where he said, always remain an amateur. He said, why? Because that keeps you hungry. And as you remain hungry, you'll always pursue new opportunities and such. When you become a professional, when you specialize, then at that point, everything closes and you become a technician. And I can think of many of my peers who are working very much in law, but they're not working as lawyers, they're working as technicians. And their practice is so finicky, is so narrow, as it needs to be because of the nature of the practice, that within 5 to 10 years, they burn out. And it's really interesting to see the high attrition rate that you have within law firms. So some 60% of those who qualify to practice law leave the practice within 5 years. And one of the greatest complaints that they have is that they're bored out of their minds. And they're bored out of their minds because day in, day out, they're doing the exact same thing. So what I say is very much, I understand the importance of specializing, and I know that your clients are looking for specialist information, but that comes then from that hunger, that desire to do right, so verifying things. And these are the skills that you try to develop, the skills to research, the skills to investigate, the skills to problem solve in that way. And you're always working in teams anyway, so there's other people whose information you can build upon, and then together you can come up with a strategy for dealing with this situation. But be cautious about that over-specialization, which is really what we see taking place today. That over-specialization is what ultimately numbs the mind and really dulls the soul.
Okay, any more questions? Don't be shy.
Hi, thanks for all your wonderful personal stories. I think it's great sharing. Thank you. So I'm not a law applicant either. I'm way past that age. I help students with their dreams. So I always get the question, I want my daughter or son to apply for law at Oxford. That's a really big, really common question as an education consultant. And what happens is also I get a lot of parents thinking that the children are really good with creative writing. And they say, my son or daughter is really good with creative writing, they should become a lawyer. So what I want to ask you all is first, what are good traits of a student to make them kind of suitable for a law degree? That's my first question. And my second question is, what are the common misconceptions of studying law? Because I feel in this industry that we're in, that there are a lot of misaligned expectations. I think it is good to pick a path, like you mentioned, Emily. Like, it's good to pick a path. But I also think that it's very important to make a very informed decision before you pick that path and do the best research you can before you actually choose as well, before you take that action. And so this is one of the questions I want to open to you guys so that I guess the rest of the room knows a little bit more about whether law is for them or not. Thanks.
Law professor?
So let me answer this sort of, I'll try to be brief, and let me answer it in a series of parts then. So the first thing that I say is that I have a variety of students in the lecture theatre. So it so happens that we happen to have 2 dancers. I've had other dancers in my lecture theatre before. I've had other chemists and mathematicians. I've had political science and historians. I've had political economists, and those coming more from biochemistry. So you have a variety of personalities that will enter law. That's the first thing. The second thing to say is that the skills that you're required to develop are going to be skills that will allow you to understand the law and then to problem solve around the law. That is very much what you're going to be doing in law school. So you'll read about the law, and then you'll be presented with a problem, and you have to know how to apply it and how to engage with it in the different facets of it. So there are certain personalities that suits better. A-type personalities tend to be the ones who do well in it, largely because of their attention to detail. Creative types do better as legal academics than they do as lawyers. And they do better as legal academics since law itself it's a social phenomenon. Why do people obey the law? I'm actually giving a talk on that then tomorrow. That is a question. It's a fascinating question. Why do they obey? And there are a variety of ways that you can answer that, and creative types who pursue then legal academia can be successful in that. But a creative type is not going to do so well when it comes to the practice of law, because you ultimately have to stifle your creativity. Really what you're there to do is very much, as I said before, as almost a technician, to solve a problem in your client's interests. So bearing that in mind. Different personalities can thrive coming from different backgrounds, but there are certain type of skills that we nurture. And it's important to understand that those are the skills that you're going to nurture, and that in the end has a almost transformative impact even on your personality. And many of our students have said they come in and they feel really creative, and when they leave, they don't. Largely because you are forced to think like a lawyer, which is one of the things that we pride ourselves on, and that's very much how to resolve these legal problems that your future clients will face.
I also want to just add and reinforce what Mohsin said about how different it is studying law and practicing law. And I was precisely one of the examples that Mohsin gave about the creative people who very much enjoyed the study of law. I genuinely really enjoyed it. I was one of those excruciating students in the seminar groups who would always be like, but what is the law? But of course, when you go out and go into practice, no one cares about what is the law. People just care about whether my client, is going to win the case or not, or if my client's problem is going to be resolved or not. And because of that, I was very stifled in the legal environment after I left. And this is despite the fact that I got a training contract at the time, one of the more creative law firms, and none of them are creative, to be very honest with you. Yeah, so I think I just wanted to share that very briefly to reinforce how, lots of people can thrive in a law degree situation, law degree sort of environment. However, it is very different. If you do well at law in university, it does not mean that you will be a lawyer. It does not mean that you will be a good lawyer or a happy lawyer. I had many friends who graduated with a first, ended up at a magic circle firm, and 2 years later are now doing something else. And conversely, I had many friends who scraped by with a 2-1, but now are very successful, very happy solicitors or barristers. So just bear that in mind, going into law school, it does not necessarily mean that you are bound to be there forever. And even if you don't do well, there are options for you in law if you truly want to stay in it. However, doing well also does not mean that you necessarily have to become a lawyer.
Yeah, I just want to add to that as well, because I think what I found at law school, and Mohsin alluded to this earlier because we talked about it, was that I thought I was a type A personality until I went to law school. And then I realized I was probably like a B+. In the sense that, I am outgoing and I am interested in engaging with other people, but I found myself surrounded by super competitive young people whom I just didn't feel like I wanted to keep up with. And I ended up making friends with like a few nice people whom I'm still friends with a few years later. And some of them actually thrive as partners in law firms. They're doing super well. They love, so the creative in me also, thankfully I didn't go into practice because I did a work placement during my summer holidays and was like, oh, this is not for me. Because it just felt that the study of law really was a mismatch for me between what I was studying and then what practice was all about. Because the thing that I don't like minutiae. I'm not a details person. Ask my colleagues sitting at the back. But I am not a details person. And I found that was the hardest thing for me about my work placement was how much I had to pay attention to detail. That said, that like Jed obviously is in practice and he likes it and he finds it interesting. And it's the same with some of the people that I went to law school 20 years ago, who are still in practice and who are doing really well. So I think the point of this is really for you to think about what works for you. And if you do pursue a law degree, do it not necessarily with the intention of going into practice. Do it for the love of the game, as it were, yeah. I think. Yeah. But that's a personal opinion. I'm just aware of the time. So maybe did we answer your questions tomorrow? I don't know. Yeah, we did? Okay, good. Any other questions? Any students have any questions? No, you're too shy to ask. Okay. You'll have to get used to it in your seminars because they'll put you under pressure. I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, am I really that stupid?
No, but if you don't ask questions, you will get picked on.
That's certainly true of
Guilty.
Yeah. Oh, look at that quiet one in the corner. Let's ask her. Jennifer! No, I'm kidding. Okay, great. So we'll be around for the next couple of minutes anyway for any questions that you might have. But we're so glad you came and joined us today, and I hope you found it useful. I hope it's given you a platform to start thinking about whether or not you want to study law. Okay? Thanks very much. Okay, that's it.